Hey guys, welcome to another episode here. This time we're going to be talking with Escrow and Title, and two of my very favorite people in the world. We go way back. Nicky Balliet with Chicago Title, Don Graham also with Chicago Title. I've worked with them for, well, so long that I probably would date myself in the industry, just so you know. They were just really young when we started. That's where it all started way back when. Hi guys, thanks for joining us today on the webinar. I appreciate it. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yep. It's
Absolutely.
good to be here. We're happy to be part of the conversation.
Well, I can't think of two people who know escrow and title better than you two. So here we go. So I want to start by just asking some basic questions. Nicky, let's chat with you to start with. What is escrow? What's it for? What's it about? What's the purpose of escrow with a purchase and a refinance transaction?
Okay. So escrow basically can have many different roles in the transaction, but primarily why people want to go through escrow is to take in all of the funds so that we can be a mediator, so that we can work with real estate agents, we can work with lenders, we can work with buyers and sellers, we can take in all the funds, and then we can disperse all the funds. There's a lot of stuff in between there, but we're known as a neutral third party. So we really are able to mediate and navigate everything with all parties while keeping neutral. And that's primarily our job.
Okay, I understand that certainly holding the funds in a very careful account so that it doesn't get lost or stolen by anybody is a real crucial part of this. What about the documents that you prepare and stuff like that, Nicky, as well for escrow? Describe a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Yeah. So we very specifically have the role in transferring the title. So that's taking it out of the current owner's name and putting it into who's purchasing the property. And so we prepare a deed with everything that runs with the property so that that property is being transferred correctly. And then when everybody has given us their funds and we get the go-ahead, we record that and make it official with the county that that the property is in. Yep.
That's what transfers the ownership from one person to the other. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. The other really important document that I can think of is our settlement statement. So that has all of the numbers. So that just takes into account either the refinance loan amount or the purchase price, depending on what transaction we're doing. And then it takes into account all debits and credits and comes out with, usually we have to come to zero at the very end of it. So that means we take all the funds and get it down to zero, kind of like an accountant would do.
Got it. Yep. Makes good sense. All right. Basic purpose of the escrow. Thanks, Nicky. Don, what's the purpose of title? What title and what's title insurance all about?
Title insurance, a big question, and most people don't even think about it, don't know they have it. Title insurance.
You're right.
Right? Yeah. Title insurance is the search of the public record all the way back to state patent. Now, again, you may have listeners that are in Washington state and beyond. The principles, though, of title insurance are essentially the same from state to state.
Okay.
We are searching the record title to make certain that all matters are disclosed. That's the big term. Be those easements, conditions, agreements, and we get into some of those matters. It can be liens, can be judgments, can be other matters that can encumber one's ownership or rights to property. So we're flushing all of that out so that you are, at the end, when Nicky has dispersed funds, receiving title to the property in the state that you had intended to get it.
Okay. So that means that you produce a title report up front. Is that correct?
Yes, that is what we do. The stage one is we produce what is called a title commitment. It is the title insurance company's commitment to insure based on the listed number of exceptions. Okay, now bringing up things that will go right over my head and most other people's heads too. But that's what this examining process does, is it brings up all the conditions, all the exceptions that are attaching to that property's title. So the title commitment is that roadmap that escrow is going to be following, that you as the lender are going to be following, and making certain that all the unnecessary items are extinguished, done away with.
Okay. Now, I know this is really broad, unnecessary items and the exceptions you're talking about, Don. You talked about some, there's liens that are on title. What other kinds of things should a buyer and or seller be really aware of and looking for when they're looking at their preliminary title report?
You know, John, you bring up one of those questions that I had written down here to address, and that falls under, well, that's not what I wanted. That wasn't what I intended out to get. You know, people don't think when they get caught up in the emotion of their purchase that there might be covenants. Covenants, CC&Rs in other words.
Right.
Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The primary purpose of those is, of course, to keep everybody in the same agreement and fold. The thing that comes up most often under covenants, conditions, and restrictions, otherwise known as CC&Rs, are going to be whether or not a resident can have a pet. What are the restrictions on pets? This comes up all the time. So knowing in advance what your CC&Rs are relating to, of course, the most common pets, parking, and last but not least, whether I can rent the property.
Significant things, yes.
Yep, those things come up. Under that same comment, then I also bring forward a party acquiring property should know what easements burden a property.
It's a biggie thing. Don, let's pause for a moment. What is an easement, please?
An easement is another person's right to use some portion of your property. Another person's right. Now, you still own the property, but this other person has an easement right for access, has an easement right for their fence line, has an easement right for their septic and drain field. Keep in mind now, CC&Rs, easement rights, and other items here don't just apply to your residents inside the city limits. We could be talking rural property. We can also be talking condominiums and communities. So keep in mind that CC&Rs, easements. Next on that list was agreements. Many times there will be agreements that bind parties to a financial participation in something.
Right.
Typically, that would be an access easement.
Right.
Things along those lines. HOAs. Yep.
HOA.
Yeah. HOAs. These are these exceptions, John, getting back to our earlier comments. These are the exceptions that you're looking for in your title commitment. And just to run across two more items here that I think are real important to be aware of are mineral rights.
Right.
When you're purchasing property now in Washington, particularly Western Washington, mineral rights have been reserved since the beginning of time. And the entity, the company that has reserved those mineral rights may not even exist anymore. You need to be aware if there are mineral right reservations on this property you're purchasing, chances are they can be dispensed of, but you need to be aware that they're there. And the last thing that I want to make sure we bring up here are surveys.
Oh, yes, important.
Being aware of whether or not there is, and couldn't agree with you more, John, it is important to know.
Yeah. So, Don, there's so much there that the average individual is going to go, oh my goodness, how am I supposed to keep track of this? And what do I look for? And I mean, what I'm sure you even buy this thing. So kind of guide us through this, what the title officer's role is on making sure all of that is okay. And how does somebody become aware that there's a problem with their title when they're buying a property?
Well,
Well,
this is my partner here.
yeah, that brings to light escrow. So
there you go. Back to you, Nikki.
Yep, as Don mentioned at the beginning, or he may not have mentioned, but it gives us, the title report gives escrow a roadmap to the transaction. So it gives us the how-tos, what, who, everything we need to know about the property, and everything related to it. So our main purpose is to make sure, of course, like he was saying, the incoming buyer is getting a clean, clear title report, meaning any and all loans, mortgages, as other people know them. They're known to us as a deed of trust, which is like a mortgage on the title to the property. That, of course, will be paid off. We need to also check to see who is on title, who currently owns it. Is that the person that's on the purchase and sale agreement? Is that who is trying to sell the property? So those have to match, of course. We have to make sure that the person selling the property has authority to do so. And then we just take it from there. We go right down the line on the title report, looking at easements, looking at CC&Rs, looking at any liens, encumbrances, anything on that title report that really should not be there for the new incoming buyer. And it is our job to clear that up. So we're the title clearing portion of the transaction. So we take a question with every single item on there. Exactly. And we make sure it's clean.
Yep. Well put, Nikki. Understand, guys, also the underwriter from a lending perspective is going to be looking at the title report. We're going to look at it, my team and myself, when it goes in, and we have looked at a lot of them. We're going to be looking for problems. We want, as a lender, we get insured by title as well for a particular lien position on the property. We know what the condition of title is. If there's problems there that we see, we're going to make sure that they are addressed before this thing records and gets closed. So there's a lot of people looking at it, Nikki being one for escrow, us being on the lending side of things, to make sure we have what's called clear title with no outstanding exceptions that Don's talking about that you would be concerned about when it closes.
And that, John, that's one of those thoughts that I was having as well. These are the checks and balances. These are the checks and balances that go into making certain that the buyer, as you say, we're bringing up a lot of terms that are not everyday conversation.
Right.
People, one of the points I want to be sure that we address today was that this is not for instant recall purposes. This is just to give you an idea. And so that you have that aha moment if somebody brings up agreements, CC&Rs, easements. I heard that guy talking about it. So, right. Yeah, it's one of those aha moments. These are the checks and balances. Buyers and sellers, and again, let's keep in mind parties refinancing. They need to know whether or not there are circumstances that can be cleaned up in their title in the process of completing the loan they've applied for with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. Yeah, checks and balances is a good way to put that, and I like that. You have a lot of people looking at this transaction and title, guys, to make sure that it goes smooth and closes well. So let's chat about getting prepared for this process from your perspective. This is your opportunity now to let us know, as the loan officer, when I'm sitting down talking to my clients, I let them know exactly what they need to do to be prepared for the loan. But how about escrow and what we should be prepared, what can they do, if anything, Nikki, to get prepared for escrow and make it go a little smoother?
Sure. So I have kind of a list of potential delays. If those were to come in our way, they might delay escrow. So I'll just very quickly kind of go down the list,
sure,
and then expound on anything that you might want me to. So we would want to, of course, know if there was a homeowners association. They charge fees. Oftentimes it's monthly, sometimes it's annually. Sometimes there is an assessment. If it's a shared property, we need to know exactly what's being charged so that we can prorate that correctly and make sure that gets paid out at closing, so there's no potential liens in the future. So an HOA, letting us know that information right away, we can get those figures right, shortly thereafter. And then any purchase contract that we have will need to be fully filled out with all the information that will allow us to open the title and escrow. So, and those are quickly buyer name, seller name, property address, parcel number, legal description, and full signatures and initials of all parties. So, and purchase
Good.
price. Those items usually are on a pre-made form, but
The purchase sale.
yeah, we have some people that are purchasing or selling a property and they're kind of doing that on their own. So just as long as we have the items needed to give us enough to get title opened, and then they'll pull all of the information that's needed. So knowing how, like you said, John, when you're working with your lender, knowing how you're going to be sending us your funds and from which accounts those are coming from. So you're buying a property typically, or you're refinancing a property and you might need to deposit some funds into escrow. Checking with the lender first to be sure that the account you want those funds to come from has been approved by your lender. That comes up sometimes, to where if it comes from an account that your lender didn't look at, those funds sometimes aren't able to be used. So
Yeah,
that's really important.
exactly.
Yeah. Having your ID. So however you're going to sign needs to be matching some kind of a piece of photo ID for our notary purposes. So if you've recently got married, divorced, for any reason changed your name, it's important to have that documentation, even if you don't have a current photo ID with it. Have the back of your state and your old ID to match those. So a marriage certificate, for instance, with your old driver's license, because you're going by that name, but it's not official yet, something like that. That happens a lot. That comes up a lot. A statement of identity. So this is kind of touching on title, but just knowing that there are certain people that have a very common name. Sue Smith. Somebody named Sue Smith, we're going to need to know a little bit more information, because what we do is run their names for any potential liens. We're probably going to ask Sue Smith to fill out something that gives us more information, including a middle initial, a social security number, things we can match, because there's going to be a lot of items that come up against a common name. So just to have, maybe prepare somebody, if they have a common name, maybe to just let them know that might be coming their way. The other thing is just have the buyers and sellers know who they're working with. Buyers primarily, and refinance borrowers know who their lender is, know who their homeowner's insurance is. That kind of information is important to share with primarily you, the lender, but us as well, so that we can be prepared if we need to get invoices as well.
Yeah.
And the only other thing is, if you're leaving town, if you're going on a vacation, we like to know about that.
Yeah.
During the time when we're going to be contacting you for signatures, that's really important to know. We have wonderful resources. We have a nationwide notary service that we can use, and they're at our disposal, but it's always really important for us to know if you're not going to be in the area when we need you to sign paperwork. So just kind of heading all this off at the beginning really makes for a nice, smooth transaction when we know all of the stuff going in.
Good job. Yeah. So, Nikki, as a question here, what percentage of closings now do you have that are all electronic fundings and signings? Do you have that very much now?
I actually haven't had 100% all electronic as of yet. So I have had, there's one lender that there are only 5 documents, and those are the notary documents that need to be signed in person, and the remaining are done digitally. But they still are requiring, a lot of lenders are not accepting those digital notarizations.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we still find need for in-person signings with a notary on all transactions thus far.
Yeah, we've talked about it for years, guys, and I'm sure it's going to be moving more that direction for all electronic signing. But right now, some of those documents need what we call a wet signature. That's why it's really important you do it, Nikki says, and be available to sign that document someplace. And if you're out of state because you went on a vacation, that means it gets sent down there, and the original has to get sent back to escrow before we can record. That can delay things for a day or two or more. So you want to be really aware of that going into the transaction. Yeah. Don, any comments on this? I don't know if there's anything they can do to prepare for a title, but any thoughts that you had while Nikki was chatting?
Nikki brought up a very, very good point. The ID affidavit, the common name scenario, that is one how they can best prepare. Just thought it'd be important or noteworthy to bring up a conversation I had yesterday. Bright and early, I got a call from a broker who had his seller standing there in his office, and he was calling to say that his seller is closing in less than 2 weeks. And he knows he has some items on title. In that case, he had a couple of liens, and he had a few years of back taxes owing. Yes. So he was getting to that point of being anxious about being able to clear these things. Now, perhaps could have addressed that before the transaction was mutual, but by the time, people are caught up again in the emotions of a transaction and only later begin to realize that there may be some stumbling blocks. So it's never too late to open that conversation with your escrow officer. The relationship that you have there is going to be invaluable in terms of keeping the transaction on course and on time. But in this example that I was speaking to, I met with that buyer then yesterday afternoon, and his circumstances were nowhere near the cumbersome matter that he thought they were or would turn out to be.
Good.
Nowhere near. We were able to put him in contact with the lien creditor.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And they were able to resolve what needed to be done in order to get those liens released in a very timely manner. Made escrow aware that we had a few years of back taxes to be reconciled in the settlement statement that she mentioned. In the course of a half an hour to 45 minutes, this gentleman was walking out of the office with the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders. He felt incredibly better. And of course, this is the impact that people want and need to have when they're involved in these largest transactions that they engage themselves in their lifetime.
Very possible. Yeah.
There's very strong professionals like yourself, escrow and title, that you want to know the role and how they can help you through the process.
Yeah. Good comment, Don. The theme of this, guys, is we're all here to help you get through the process as easy as possible. So complete that ID affidavit for escrow and title is a big deal right up front. So if things pop up on title, they can tell fairly quickly if they are or are not yours and deal with them. The sooner the better. And then, as Don so well articulated there, sometimes you think it's really a big deal, but they do this all the time. And if you chat with them and communicate well, you might find that it's not that big of a deal and they're going to handle it for you. So good.
It's what we do every day. It's
Yeah.
what we do. That's our job. And following up on other important items and how people can best prepare for their purchase and or their sale, be aware of how you are going into title, be aware of how you're going out of title, know whether you're titled to the property today, if you're refinancing and or selling, is it in your community? Is it in your marriage? Is it yours separately?
Oh, yeah.
More important today, we're finding that people have put properties into or intend to put their purchase into an LLC or a trust. Title insurance is going to require copies of the LLC and the trust.
Good thought,
And
Don. Good thing to bring up.
also, one other set of circumstances that can be very emotionally straining in a transaction. And let me tell you, there's no one better than your escrow person to help you through the process, but that is an estate. Dealing with estate transfers. So they are handled differently based on circumstances involving the party that has passed. But again, being prepared in advance, have that conversation with your lender. So your lender understands that we're going to be dealing with an estate interest. Can be a big, big time saver.
Yeah, see, kind of confusing and maybe a little overwhelming when you hear Nicky and Don talk about this stuff, guys. But again, they deal with it all day long. So just ask enough questions and let them know what you want to do. Let us know, the lender up front, let your real estate agent know right up front that you want to invest title in a certain manner, and we can handle it, especially if it's early on.
Yeah, just piggybacking on that. Good. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, knowing everything ahead of time, like you said, being prepared ahead of time, knowing everything right up front is so helpful for us. We can get all the information needed over to title, like Don was saying, trust documents, LLC documents, any information regarding an estate, for them to give the thumbs up. Basically, they need to look at it, make sure that you have authority to do what you're doing, which is selling or buying a property, and determining who can sign paperwork, and just be sure that all of that matches. So that basically is, once we have that all cleared up and everything matches, we have the green light. We can go forward with the transaction. We know exactly, everybody has their expectations met. We know exactly what we need, and that's been done. So, and then marital status is a huge one, and that does vary from state to state. I'm glad you brought that up, Don, just because I could give you a million examples of what people understand versus what will be required of title. So just to break it down and keep it really black and white, in the eyes of title insurance, if you own a property or if you're buying a property, they need to know your marital status, and you are either married or you are unmarried. There's not really any in between. So if you're in the process of getting a divorce, if you're in the process of getting married, those don't count. So, and in Washington state, it's a community property state. So that means that anything that you're doing has to tie to your spouse while you're still married.
Legally or otherwise.
Right. So that has to be taken into consideration. Some people have been legally separated I just had one 20 years. They've been legally separated for 20 years.
That's the longest I think I've heard, Nicky. That's a long time.
Me too. We had to locate the spouse, or what she called him her ex-spouse, which she considered that. We had to locate him to sign a document for this transaction.
There you go.
Yep. So it just is, keeping it black and white. You either are married or not, and find out from your usually escrow, title, and loan officer what's going to be required in your state as far as that's concerned.
And if I can add 2 cents worth on that, this is one of the primary tenets of your title insurance. One of the primary tenets. We are ensuring that your seller's interest has been completely conveyed. Again, one of those terms you're not going to remember, but rest assured, when you have title insurance, you aren't going to get that knock on the door at some point later on down the road that there was an interest and that we still own this house and you'll have to get out. Those kinds of things are all addressed by your title insurance company and completed by your escrow company side.
Thankfully.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very welcome knock on the door. So you want to avoid that one, I'm sure.
That falls under the whoops, I forgot.
Right.
Yeah, maybe even stronger language at that time, I'm sure. Oops.
Right.
We do have a viewing audience. Anybody in the webinar, if you have any questions, now's the time to put them in the chat box, please. I'm going to have Nikki and Don both wrap it up with a couple things here. But if you have a question, put it in there. This is your opportunity to ask an escrow officer and title rep directly some questions about escrow and title. I asked you guys earlier about maybe the funnest, the most interesting, the most difficult, whatever you want to talk about. Example of a transaction that you had, Don, you had a pretty good, or actually Nikki, that's a good one. 20 years separated, or not still married and not together. Any other things you want to just bring up that might help educate us as what not to do, or some interesting transaction you were involved with that you remember really well?
Gosh, well, I was thinking of one last night, kind of to go piggyback on the bad knock on your door. So this was probably 8 months ago or so. So we had somebody was selling a property, and she owned it with her spouse, and her spouse had passed, and she provided us the documentation needed to prove that. So that's, as Don said, that can be an emotional time, but she was, selling the property, and at the time we met her. So title requires a lot of documentation. To put it simply, title would like to make sure that there's not an heir to that person that passed away that's going to come back later and say, hey, what about me? You forgot about
Right.
me. And so they do their due diligence there to be sure that all of those bases are covered so that the funds are placed where they should be. So in this case, we almost got to closing, and we had most of that cleared up, believing that the person that passed away did not have a will, because that's what we were told. And I had to get one document delivered to me, and the person selling the property brought me a whole stack of papers that she found. In that was a will.
Uh-oh.
Oh my.
And her husband, had not only done a will, but had specified in that will that the property at hand was to go 50% to his brother. And then the remaining to his spouse.
Oh my.
We definitely, we dodged a huge bullet there. Let's just say that. So we were able to read that will and get in touch then with the proper parties that had to also agree to selling of the property. And basically that became unraveling the whole thing, making sure that they were okay with selling the property because they had a say in it now too, which means the purchase price was in question. Every single thing at that point that had been done had to be basically undone and get permission from these other parties. And it was, so that's just an example of making sure that all of the ducks are in a row when you go to sell a property, because that could have gone so terribly wrong. Had that person learned later on, of course, that they had 50% that was going to them, and we didn't ask them about that. So, so that's
good night. What a nightmare that'd be.
That was a first for me. I'm telling you. Usually, it doesn't get to that point, but that was a scary one.
Giving a little peace of mind to everyone listening here, let me just add that no two transactions are alike. There just isn't such a thing. They all differ in major ways, similar, very small ways, but no two are alike. No question should be felt to be too ridiculous, too crazy to ask. We welcome all those questions. We really do, because we want to keep things on time, on a timeline that everyone anticipates is going to happen flawlessly. So raising those questions, not thinking that your situation is so kooky or crazy that you don't want to bring these questions up until it's too late. Probably not the best time. Be assured you're in good company. We probably haven't heard that story before. So please.
Yes,
maybe
ask
not.
questions. All the questions are welcome.
All day long.
Yeah.
Well, funny you should say that, because one of our guests asked this question: what about a 1031 exchange? So guys, for the viewing audience, a 1031 exchange is when someone sells an investment property, and if they were to sell it and receive the cash, they could get taxed on that. It's called capital gains tax. It can be very significant depending on what their gains are on the property, which can be kind of sophisticated. You want to talk to your CPA about that. You can delay, defer, whatever the right word here is, that tax by doing something called a 1031 exchange, which means you're going to sell the property. The funds go on to what's called an exchange facilitator. They hold the funds and they use those to buy another property, which delays or defers the tax till a later date. So that's what it is. Nikki, Don, any comments on 1031 exchange, how that would change things or what we need to be aware of there, please?
So it does change things. We like to know about those right up front. The 1031 companies work closely hand in hand with escrow, more so than title, I would say, because they ask us to sometimes prepare documents in a certain way, mentioning them. For tax purposes, it needs to, the tax deferred exchange company needs to show as either the buyer or seller, whichever leg of that transaction is happening, so as to protect that money and shelter it from tax during that transaction. So none of those dollars can hit somebody's account who is doing that tax, the 1031. Yeah. So yeah, so it's important to just get us connected, basically. The 1031 company and escrow just need to know each other's information, and we would take it from there just to be sure that we have what we need, and we'll work together to get that. So
yes,
what a great phrase. They're going to take it from there. And then that's what they do. Yeah. I just want you to know that.
Right? As she says, whether you're purchasing with 1031 deferred exchange funds,
right,
or you're selling with the intention, again, make escrow aware of your 1031 business as early on at the very beginning of your transaction, and things will go much more smoothly.
Absolutely.
That's a very, very good question.
yes,
it's a great question. Thanks, Starla, for asking that question, by the way. And just so you know, not the next couple webinars, but down the road, we're going to have a 1031 facilitator chat with us about the whole 1031 exchange process. And there's a lot more to it than what we just covered here in a couple minutes, and it'll be really interesting. You can be on that webinar. Okay, any closing comments, guys? Oh, somebody's typing something I see, and maybe another question coming in. Oh, thanks, Starla. I appreciate that. Starla said, thank you for the answer to that. So I do believe, did you volunteer to, I can give out your contact information, and if somebody wants to contact you later on with a title or an escrow question, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah, did you want me to give my information here, or are you going to?
You can give it right now, because we do have some people on the webinar right now and they can hear it. And what we're going to do, Nikki and Bon, we'll put it on the YouTube video, so it'll be there right on the video, and they can contact you however you want them to do so.
Great. So I have a direct phone line, and that number is 425-259-8987. And a great way to get in touch with me is email. So that's my first name dot my last name, which is NICKY.BALLIET@CTT.com. And one other thing, you can also text that phone number that I gave you previous, and that's a new feature for us. So if you just had a question, yeah. So even though it's a landline, it can be texted to digitally, and so we have, again, that's working great for us. So
good,
if you need to reach us, yep, there's my info.
There you go. All right, and for me, Don Graham, my cell phone number, 24/7, feel free to call, 425-327. I work John's hours, by the way. There you go. 425-327-9752. And my email address is donald.graham, GRAHAM, @CTT.com.
Great. I will tell you, thanks for that, Don. I call Don at kind of odd hours now and then when I have a question. He
I was
typically
gonna
picks
say.
up. So,
John, we have talked at odd hours. I will just throw in there.
I can
yeah,
attest to you.
Right.
yeah, I know both their cell numbers, so there. All right, guys, thanks so much. Nicky Balliet, Don Graham, Chicago Title. Really appreciate your time today and going over escrow and title. Informative. I know we could talk for another hour and a half if we wanted to about this, but you guys were great. Really, thank you for coming on with us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having
You're
us,
very
John.
welcome. Thanks again.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye, guys.